The great challenge that has been thrown in the face of God's people has been the physical enormity of the worldwide flood. This, coupled with the survival of a single family and every animal type in existence, and by living through this worldwide catastrophe in a large floating box, the Ark of Noah. This seems impossible to most. A flood of criticism is brought onto those who believe this story and is used to poke fun at them. Their belief that this was an accurate historical event is something that the educated of this world do not accept, and look on those who do as uneducated. In turn, this skepticism has forced those who believe the flood account to prove it with physical evidence, such as the present structure of the Ark in Kentucky. It was built as a replica of the original Ark. But many read over the biblical account of how Noah kept the passage of time that he and his family spent in the ark, not understanding its importance. He recorded an accurate account of the passage of time of the flood year. This is the hidden message of how God records and measures time, proving the historical accuracy of the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation. The timeline presented here places every important event of the Bible in its correct date order. It is the description of the great flood and how Noah and his family lived through it by faith that also records the exact number of days in the flood year. As already stated, it is Noah's time log, which is absolutely vital to know how God tracks time. All people are amazed by the magnitude of the worldwide flood. The whole world being immersed in water, causing most to miss the important log of time preserved by Noah and his account, including the scholars and chronologists. By accurately compiling the time elements of the flood year, the most important time key is revealed, demonstrating how God marks time in Genesis through Revelation. See what Noah recorded in Genesis 7:4. For after 7 more days, I will cause it to rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things that I have made. Also, Genesis 7:11 and 12. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Notice how specific God is in naming the exact time elements of the month, week, and days. There are 2 Sabbaths occurring on certain days of the 2nd month, as pointed out in a previous presentation titled Proving the Calendar Generator. The generator tracks time in 7-day increments of the creation week without losing a single day of this count. Looking at the year 2386 BC, it is seen that the second month has the Sabbaths on the 3rd, 10th, and 17th, which confirms these dates as Sabbaths. The year 2386 BC, or 1661 AM, duplicates the same number of days, placing them in the correct number of months. Also, the weekdays fall on the correct numbered days of the month. The Sabbath rotation for the flood year can now be determined as shown in the generator above. The 2 Sabbaths already mentioned occur on certain days of the second month, as the calendar shows. As time is compiled from Noah's log, it presents a defining number of days for the year of the flood. The first month has 30 days. The 17th day of the second month as the first day of the 40 days of rain, leaving 46 days from the beginning of the year to the beginning of the flood. 30 plus 16 equals 46. Repeating in Genesis 7:11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. The breaking up of the fountains of the deep depicts massive earthquakes releasing immeasurable quantities of water, producing incredible tsunamis and storms of violence that modern man has never witnessed. No man-made shelter could have withstood the enormity of the violence that passed over the face of the earth. Verse 12 says, "And the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights." This verse records that the initial length of the outpouring of water was 40 days. And Genesis 7:17 confirms it. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. Note that it was the accumulation of water during the 40 days that resulted in lifting the ark high above the earth. The description in verses 17 through 23 is relating to what took place as a result of the 40 days of rain and the breaking up of the fountains of the deep. At the end of 40 days, the ark was 15 cubits above the highest mountain. Verse 20. This was 15 cubits from the bottom of the ark to the top of the highest mountain. Genesis 7:24. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. The basic meaning of the Hebrew word that is translated prevailed is to be strong or mighty. The waters did not prevail over the earth on the first or second day of the flood. They prevailed at the end of the 40 days when the flood reached its maximum depth, making the 150 days of prevailing consecutive to the 40 days of rain. Both periods of time need to be included in order to determine the total length of time of the events of the flood year. As recorded in the scriptural account, God did not allow the level of the flood waters to drop until they had prevailed 150 days. He prevented this by sending additional rain and by bringing up waters from the fountains of the deep. God caused the water to continue 150 days to maintain the level at 15 cubits above the highest mountain. This ensured the depth of all air-breathing life on land. Genesis 8, 1 through 3. Then God remembered Noah and every living thing, and all of the animals that were with him in the ark. And God made the wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. The waters receded continually from the earth. At the end of 150 days, the waters decreased. These verses describe the process by which God began to dry up the floodwaters. This process continued for an extended period of time, as demonstrated by the word translated decreased or abated at the end of verse 3. This word is used in the account to describe the removal of the waters from the flooded earth. Gesenius, a Hebrew scholar of the Old Testament, gives the following definition of this word. Quote, to be devoid of anything, to lack, to be without, followed by an accusative. End of quote. As we continue to examine the scriptural account, we will learn the exact length of time that it took for the waters of the flood to recede and the ground to have no standing water. Genesis 8:4. Then the ark rested in the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat. This verse gives the impression that the ark settled down on the mountains of Ararat because the waters had started to decrease. However, for the ark to rest on the ground would have required the depth of the water to have fallen considerably. The highest mountains were covered to a depth of 15 cubits. Not a great depth until you consider that 15 cubits of water is above the tallest mountain. Mount Ararat at 17,000 feet is not the tallest mountain. Therefore, more than 15 cubits separated the ark from Mount Ararat. In addition, consider that the date given for this occurrence was the 7th month, the 17th day, and was only 194 days into the 600th year. Nisan 1 through Tishri 17th. However, this scriptural account records that 236 days of that year had passed before God started to dry up the floodwaters. 46 plus 40 plus 150 equals 236. If you figure that the 40 days of rain were part of the 150 days, the total would still be 196 days before the waters began to decrease. It was therefore impossible for the ark to have lodged on the ground on the 17th day of the 7th month, as the waters had not yet begun to decrease, leaving 46 days, the actual number of days from the resting to the time that the waters began to decrease. What then is the meaning of the word rested in Genesis 8:4? The word rested is describing a stopping of movement or activity. This same Hebrew word is used in Exodus 20:11. God rested on the seventh day. His activity or movement ended. The use of this word in Genesis 8:4 tells us that the ark remained immobile at a specific location. It was no longer rolling and plunging through turbulent waters. The winds that had driven it ceased to blow. The waves subsided, and the waters surrounding the ark became calm and placid. The ark came to a stop, as if God had anchored it above the tops of the mountains. God maintained the location of the ark at Mount Ararat not because it was physically stuck, but because he wanted it there. It did not settle upon the ground until after the waters had abated from their original depth above Mount Ararat. The scriptural account reveals that the decreasing of the waters took place gradually over the remaining months of the year. To determine the total passage of time in the account of the flood, it is necessary to note the exact date that the last of the waters dried up. This date is recorded in Genesis 8:13. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked. And indeed, the surface of the ground was dry. This verse tells us that the waters were dried up on the first day of the 601st year. And Noah's removal of the covering confirms this fact. This state of dryness was reached exactly 150 days from the time that the waters had ceased to prevail. The design of the covering reveals an important feature of the construction of the ark. In addition, the window construction reveals the curious reason for Noah sending out the dove in order to determine that the flood waters were gone. He could have just opened the window and looked down at the ground. But the placement of the windows was such that Noah could not look down to see the land until he had removed the covering. The need for fresh air would have meant that the ark had many windows strategically placed to provide ventilation, which was absolutely necessary for the survival of both animals and people on the ark. The roof would have had a substantial overhang to prevent the rain from coming in through the ventilating windows. Therefore, Noah could not look up or down, but only out at the horizon. This limited his view of both the sky and the ground, showing that he could not use the celestial bodies to determine the passage of months, as he recorded them under the inspiration of God. It was done by using a mathematical process by counting the number of days in which he did, by observing the periods of light and dark. The 190 days of continued rain also prevented any celestial observation. This, coupled with the design of the roof, is what prevented them from viewing the sky above. It should be noted at this point that counting the initial 40 days of the flood as part of the 150 days of the waters prevailing would make the 600th year only 345 days in length. 46 days to the beginning of the flood, plus 150 days of the water prevailing, plus 150 days of the water decreasing. This equals 346 days, minus 1 day for the first day of the 601st year. This equals 345 days. There is no yearly cycle, either calculated or observed, that would fit a 345-day year. This fact confirms that the 40 days of rain and the 150 days of the waters prevailing are two separate periods of time, just as the 150 days of the waters abating were separate from the 150 days of the waters prevailing. These three periods of time extended from the second month, the 600th year of Noah's life, to the first day of the first month of the 601st year. Genesis 8:13. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked down. Indeed, the surface of the ground was dry. Once the covering was removed, Noah could then go to the edge of the ark and look down to see the ground. This verse states that on the first day of the first month, all the floodwaters were gone, and the earth was dry. But the scriptural account extends beyond this point. Genesis 8:14. And in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, a Tuesday, the earth was dried. This verse may seem to contradict the preceding verse, but the word used in verse 13 to describe the dryness of the earth does not have the same meaning as the word used in verse 14. The Hebrew word that is translated dried and dry in verse 13 is cherub. However, the Hebrew word translated dry in verse 14 is yabish. Gesenius noted that these two Hebrew words represent different levels of dryness. The first denotes an absence of water. The second represents a condition more akin to that of a lack of moisture, or withered. Verse 13 depicts a condition of no standing water, whereas verse 14 is describing dry soil that is no longer saturated. This stage of dryness was reached 56 days after the flood waters initially dried. The account records that Noah remained in the ark until the earth reached this second stage of dryness. There was good reason for waiting to leave the ark until the soil had dried. If Noah had released the animals before the ground was dry, the elephants and other large animals might have gotten bogged down and entrapped in the mud. He also had to give vegetation a chance to grow for food for the animals. After the withdrawal of the floodwaters and the drying of the ground, the earth was prepared to receive survivors of the flood. They had entered the ark on the 17th day of the second month, in the 600th year of Noah's life. The following is a computation of the number of days that passed in the year of the flood. Genesis 7:11, the flood begins on the 17th day of the second month. 30 days in the first month plus 16 days in the second equals 46 days. Genesis 7:12, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights equals 40 days. Genesis 7:24, the waters prevailed 150 days. Genesis 8:3, the waters abate 150 days. Total 386 days. Genesis 8:13, the water dried on the first day of the next year, minusing 1 day. The total is 385 days. The chronological facts that are recorded in the account in the book of Genesis clearly establish a period of 385 days in the year of the Noachian flood. This year length is significant because it is the exact number of days required for an excessive leap year in the Hebrew calendar. This remarkable account of the flood, which God inspired to be recorded in His Word, is indisputable evidence that the Hebrew calendar, which is the Metonic cycle as it is known today, was God's sacred calendar. It was put into motion in Genesis 1:17 and bears His stamp of approval. When God set them in their orbits, it became His time clock. He then set his clock on the fourth day of creation to reflect the passage of the 3 previous days. There can be no doubt that the calculations of the sacred calendar, the Metonic cycle, have been the basis of God's true calendar from the beginning. Just as the first presentation of this timeline of the Bible pointed out, it was the Metonic cycle that God set in place to track time. Or, more correctly stated, God created the Metonic cycle so that time could be tracked. He put his stamp of approval on this repeating cycle of the moon about the earth as the earth circles the sun. Now that the number of the days of the flood year is known to be 385 days, and also the minimum number of years to the flood is known as 1656. The year of the flood can be established. The year 1656 contains 6 of the 247-year Metonic cycles, with a carryover of 147 years. 1656 divided by 247 equals 6 plus 174 years. The 247-year Metonic cycle is made up of 13 segments of 19 years each. The 174 years was 9 complete segments with a carryover of 3 years. Knowing that the flood year has 385 days, and consulting chart number 5, which shows all 13 segments in their correct order, records the first year of this length to be 5 years from 1656, thus showing the flood year as 1661 AM or 2386 BC. Matthew 13:14 supports the idea that the scriptures must be searched to find the truth. In them, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, which says, "Hearing you will hear, and shall not understand, and seeing you will see, and not perceive. But the hearts of this people have grown dull. Their ears are hard of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, lest they should understand with their hearts, and turn, so that I should heal them." Having the correct year for the flood makes it possible to establish the year that Abraham left Haran, and without that year, the Exodus could not be placed, as will be shown in subsequent presentations.